Student protesters in the United States inspire worldwide movement. They're demanding their universities sever ties with Israel and vow to fight on despite a violent crackdown. Peaceful calls for change have been met with heavy-handed policing and hundreds of arrests, as the US House of Representatives passes a law which blurs the line between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel.
Right now, we have an absolute state of emergency. We have a moral imperative right now to stand up and fight this.
US presidential candidate Jill Stein was among those arrested and charged. She tells us why Americans' First Amendment right to protest is under attack. And we speak to Columbia University professor Jeffrey Sachs about the movement that started at his university and the forces aligned against it.
I think the Israel lobby has been very powerful, and the consequences are not good.
Hello, I'm Ghida Fakhry. Welcome to Bigger Than Five, where we look at the student protest movement across the United States over Israel's ongoing assault on Gaza and US support for it. Since its founding almost 250 years ago, the United States has held up the First Amendment, enshrined in its Constitution, as a cornerstone of democracy, both at home and abroad. It's meant to protect freedom of expression and the right of people to peacefully assemble, in other words, the right to protest. But today, these fundamental rights are once again being challenged. In mid-April, Columbia University's president called the New York police to break up protests against Israel's military operations in Gaza. More than 100 students were arrested, with many eventually suspended. But that only spurred on further protests at Columbia itself and right across the country. College campuses in the United States have a long history of student activism. In 1960, civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr., joined thousands of students from Atlanta University to rally against racial segregation. In 1968, Columbia University students spearheaded protests against the Vietnam War. In 1985, university students staged protests against apartheid in South Africa. And in 2003, there were mass student demonstrations against the Iraq War. Today, student protesters are demanding an end to the war on Gaza, and they want their universities to divest from companies that do business with Israel. But the peaceful protests have been met with a forceful crackdown.
We just can't allow this kind of hatred and anti-Semitism to flourish on our campuses, and it must be stopped in its tracks.
The Jewish people need our support now.
I think we as college students, we hold that privilege and we have a responsibility to protest.
We do not have to be a Muslim to have a heart to be outraged.
As you've just seen, among those arrested and charged is US presidential candidate Jill Stein. She's our first guest. Dr. Stein, the images we've seen of these campus protests and the police handling of protesters, including yourself, have shocked many around the world. In fact, you've called it state-sanctioned vigilante terror against people peacefully asserting their First Amendment rights. These are strong words.
Absolutely, and they are warranted strong words because the peaceful protesters are standing up for our right to free speech, our right to protest, and the opinion of the vast majority of the American people that this genocide must be stopped, that this is an outrage against humanity, against international rights. We are looking at the torture and murder of children on an industrial scale. The assaults on the protesters have been very much encouraged by the words of our elected officials who are condemning this, who are condemning the expression of our highest democratic ideals. You had basically riot police coming in and creating a riot in demonstrations that were otherwise eminently peaceful, multi-dimensional in terms of religious and ethnic backgrounds. As a person of Jewish background myself, these are extremely friendly, and Jews are at the forefront very much of this movement to end genocide. So yes, indeed, this is state-sanctioned terror against ordinary civilians here.
As you say, many Jews are involved in this protest movement, yet what we are seeing are members of Congress vilifying the protesters, demonizing them as Hamas supporters, as terrorists, labeling them as anti-Semitic, and the list goes on. How dangerous is this type of rhetoric? Does it compare to anything else you've seen on US campuses before?
Having grown up during the Vietnam War, and also having experienced the post 9/11 acts of political repression and Islamophobia. We've been here before, but it's it doesn't make it any less terrible and less dangerous for us to see a resurgence of this kind of just blatant political repression and Islamophobia. This is just inexcusable, and it absolutely brings out the worst in our society.
How would you treat what is going on in America today? Because in addition to being a politician, you're also a medical doctor. How would you diagnose and treat this?
I see this very much as a problem of basic democracy, a crisis of democracy that goes hand in hand with the exercise of imperial power. Empire is a very costly and dysfunctional approach to foreign policy. And on day one of an administration of my own, on day one, the flow of weapons would stop to Israel as a human rights abuser on steroids. This is actually illegal in terms of international law. It's also illegal in terms of US law. Such transfers of weapons and financial support to countries that are abusing human rights is absolutely not allowed.
Most members of Congress seem to be completely beholden to Israel and the pro-Israel lobby. How do you explain this almost hypnotic power that Israel and the Netanyahu government has over lawmakers in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this reflects the basic challenge to U.S. democracy. We have so-called the best democracy money can buy, which is no democracy at all. The power of money is off the charts here in this country in terms of the ability of not only AIPAC, but also the weapons industry to basically compel national policy.
How much room is there for honest debate, for open criticism of Israel, for anyone like you who is seeking political office?
So there's not much official room for debate, and debates are basically not happening, certainly not within the Democratic Party. But there is nonetheless an uprising, I think, among the American people, and we have seen a growing force really within the American electorate to break away from what we call the parties of war and Wall Street, which are so poorly serving Americans.
There is, though, the clear silencing of dissent and of this type of narrative. You use the word uprising. Are you surprised that the US administration is condemning this and not the killing of Palestinian civilians?
This is par for the course, and this is more of the approach we have seen from the Biden administration and from the majority of Republicans as well. So American empire is very wedded to the powerful industries here, the war industry, Wall Street, which profit and benefit from this continuing war.
Given this reality, Dr. Stein, whether you look at what's going on around the world or in the United States itself, as you point out, many people are just struggling to make ends meet. Just how determined will this make this younger generation of student protesters who've become essentially the conscience of America. How far can they keep going in pushing against these very powerful forces?
I think they have no choice, and that seems to be their opinion as well. Observing them from a distance, and also, sitting in a jail cell being processed with many of them the other day at Washington University in St. Louis, where about 100 of us were arrested as part of a peaceful protest there. They see themselves really as not having a choice.
And some of the people who are still standing firm, fighting this in the name of justice and equality and freedom of speech, are saying that the United States seems more intent on protecting Israel and distorting the reality than it is on protecting Americans' right to free speech. Is that an accurate description? Are politicians in the United States being bribed by this lobby?
Absolutely. I mean, we have a political system which is based on legalized bribery, where campaigns are powered basically by private money contributions. So yes, and in fact, my understanding is that AIPAC has publicly stated they will be spending $100 million in this election in order to basically, push their opinion on the American public. So this is the way the system works, and the American people are quite fed up with it.
If there was no such powerful lobby pushing Congress in this particular direction in such a forceful way, would we have seen a different position taken by the United States, by the administration, by the Congress? Would the reaction have been fundamentally different?
Yes, absolutely. And if you look at the opinion polls of the American people, they have been horrified by this genocide that is taking place live streamed in real time on our personal iPhones and our laptops. This is a horrifying and mobilizing moment. And from the very first polls back in November, Reuters was showing 68% of the American people want an immediate ceasefire and a diplomatic solution. So we see this in so many areas of policy where there's a complete disconnect between what the American public wants to do and what our politicians are bribed into doing. Right now, we have an absolute state of emergency. We have a moral imperative right now to stand up and fight this. The American people want to do that. It's the absence of a true democracy here in this country that prevents us from realizing the will of the people. And the American people are determined to change this process so that we don't have this very deadly disconnect between the wishes of the American people and the actions of our elected officials.
But you will always have the pro-Israel lobby. Is that the main problem?
We will have the pro-Israel lobby. However, that lobby and AIPAC should be classified as a foreign agent, in which case their hands would be tied in terms of bribing our elected officials. And, our hope is to reform the rules of the game so that private interests cannot continue to buy out our elected leaders.
As a presidential candidate, are you concerned that moving forward, America has lost the moral authority to lecture other countries, whether it's China, Russia, or others, about democracy and human rights?
Absolutely. I think for the U.S. to be not only, providing diplomatic cover for the genocide taking place, but the U.S. is a full partner in this genocide. The U.S. provides 80% of the weapons being used to kill women and children. We, provide enormous amounts of money as well as blocking UN resolutions. It's usually the U.S. and Israel against the rest of the world. So this has been extremely destructive. What's taking place in Gaza right now is not only, the ultimate human rights disaster for the people of Gaza, it's also endangering the people of Israel, whose neighbors are being mobilized against the country of Israel. And ultimately, it's really a danger to everyone, including us here in the U.S. It's not impossible to see how this war could go nuclear. So we have to be very measured, and we have to be very thoughtful about deconflicting and avoiding such conflicts. This is a big one right now that can be shut down immediately simply by the president picking up the phone. And to have that pressure in this election is absolutely critical to help the American people move forward and eliminate this crisis, bring the genocide to end, and to put an end to this extremely explosive and dangerous conflict.
Dr. Jill Stein, great to have you on the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So, just how dangerous is this moment for the United States and the rest of the world? And how beholden are academic institutions in the US to powerful lobbies that represent Israeli interests? Over the last 2 decades, around 100 US colleges have received $375 million from Israel in the form of gifts or contracts. MIT has reportedly accepted more than $11 million in research funding from the Israeli Defense Ministry in the last 10 years. Columbia protesters want the school to divest its $13.6 billion endowment from any company linked to Israel. Harvard, America's richest university with an endowment valued at over $50 billion, has investments of around $200 million in businesses tied to the Israeli military and to illegal Israeli settlements in occupied Palestinian territory. Today, House Republicans are threatening to cut federal funding for universities. But will this be enough to deter the protesters? Jeffrey Sachs is an economics professor at Columbia University. Professor Sachs, protesters at Columbia University, some of them your own students, they have faced suspension, they have faced arrests, riot police in full gear. How did Columbia students ignite this protest movement?
Columbia students watched what we're all watching, which is this horrific, murderous invasion by Israel of Gaza and tens of thousands of people being killed. And naturally, they protested that. But the predominant powers in the United States, starting with the political power, the power of the Israel lobby, the power of several forces, donors, and others on the university said, no, we don't allow this kind of protest. And this is the crackdown that we're seeing right now, completely contrary in my view, and I think widely held view, to free speech, to the norms of the university, to the way that we should be behaving. This should not be in any event about cracking down. This should be about discussion, debate, freedom to protest, but all of that has gone by the wayside in recent days.
Where does it leave freedom of speech for Americans? Because up until now, American universities, certainly elite universities like Columbia and Harvard and others, were always looked at as bastions of free thought. How did they turn into fortresses against it?
This so violates the basic norms of our university life and the norms of our society that we haven't seen the end of this. Though, of course, we have these powerful forces in the U.S. that are authoritarian, that are trying to crack down. We have a power structure in the United States that's trying to enforce its will even against the will of the American people.
You talk about powerful forces, and it seems that what we're seeing on U.S. campuses shows us the depth of the interplay between influential large donors, the pro-Israel lobby groups, AIPAC and others, and university administrations. Just how influential is AIPAC today on U.S. campuses?
Well, I think AIPAC is very influential in the U.S. Congress, and the U.S. Congress and demagogues within the U.S. Congress have been pounding on the universities, and the administrators have been giving in shamefully, in my view, mistakenly, in my view. Of course, there's also the direct role of donors to the universities who have their agendas. But when it comes to AIPAC, this is mainly working through Washington, where AIPAC is very powerful, and through the Congress. And we've seen university presidents called to the table or to the carpet by these congressmen in a completely irresponsible way, and I'm so sad to say, basically giving in to these pressures.
Some are using the F word, fascism, to describe the scenes that we've been seeing at some of these university campuses, the brutal police crackdown. Is that an overstatement?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's helpful at this moment. I would say that the authoritarian tendencies in American society are definitely on the rise, and that's because of the role of the security state. We have a very large military-industrial complex. The United States has military bases in 80 countries around the world, about 750 military bases. It has an active CIA. It's engaged in many wars and covert operations. And that means secrecy. That means repressing openness and transparency and protest. And it's all very, very dangerous.
Some have been saying on social media that, quote, Jews are scared at Columbia, that vilification of Zionism has spilled over into the vilification of Judaism. Is that something that you've seen, or are these largely manufactured claims? I mean, you yourself are Jewish American. Are you scared at Columbia?
I'm not scared at Columbia, and I think that the attack on Israeli policy, which I find abhorrent right now, and what Israel is doing is not anti-Semitic. I think this is a very mistaken or deliberately misleading claim. What the protests are about is ongoing slaughter. 35,000 Palestinians are dead by official count, but the estimates are that it's multiples of that. There are people buried under the rubble. There are people who are dying from lack of food, safe water, access to medical care. It's horrendous what's happening. That's what the protests are about. That doesn't make the protests anti-Semitic at all. It makes the protests against slaughter and the lack of political self-determination for Palestine.
And yet, this is how the protesters are being misrepresented, how they're being labeled. According to reports in the Israeli press, Israel has formulated an action plan that aims at inflicting economic and employment consequences on what it calls anti-Semitic students. It's reportedly trying to compel these universities to distance the students from their own campuses. Are you seeing this type of retribution? Is that what we can expect to see?
Well, look, first of all, Prime Minister Netanyahu entered into the U.S. campus debate, and I would like to invite him to exit the U.S. campus debate. He has no role whatsoever in discussing what's happening on American campuses. I personally find him revolting in terms of his policies, but I would say, as a Prime Minister of Israel, stay out of American campus politics, period.
Julian Assange, back in 2016, famously said that Russia is no threat to Americans. The real threat comes from Israel and the powerful pro-Israel lobby. How true are these statements? How do you change this reality, if indeed this is the case?
Well, I think the Israel lobby has been very powerful, and the consequences are not good. The United States is almost completely isolated in the world community and in global opinion. It's notable. I strongly support the proposition that Palestine should immediately become the 194th member state of the United Nations. The Security Council took up that question, and it was supported across the Security Council, but the United States vetoed it. So the U.S. stands alone right now, and the U.S. has to reclaim its own sovereignty and its own moral compass and start doing the right thing.
But how does it free itself from the hold that Israel, the Israeli government, and the pro-Israel lobby has, apparently, on all institutions in the United States?
Well, I think the way it frees itself is by recognizing that Washington is now not only isolated vis-a-vis the world community, but is isolated among the American people who do not support what the U.S. government is doing. And we can see this is the profound alienation and rejection by America's students across the country. Politicians, you need to pay attention. You need to listen to what the students are saying right now. They happen to be right, and they happen to be your constituents also. And I think that that is the main thing that Washington needs to understand, that the present policy makes no sense for the world, for peace, or for American interests.
All right, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, thank you so much for joining me.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
The United States is at a crossroads. Listen to the voices of student protesters exercising their democratic and constitutional right to free speech, or continue to be manipulated by the powerful pro-Israel lobby and the Israeli government. Will Washington uphold the freedoms and ideals it preaches to the rest of the world, or will it continue to employ the same tactics that it condemns others for? For now, it is clear that it is the students protesting on campuses who are acting as the conscience of America, filling the vacuum left by their lawmakers and pushing back against those who threaten their basic freedoms and American democracy. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team, thanks for watching.